Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a start to a good day or an end of what has been a good day. This is All Things Policy, as always, and we have an interesting conversation planned during this episode. I have Shobhankita Reddy in the studio with me. Both Shobhankita and I are research analysts with the High-Tech Geopolitics program. And Shobhankita has recently co-authored a chapter on the Chinese tech ecosystem and the rise of China in this technological world that we live in. And I've always been interested in learning more about this topic, and I presume you are as well. And when I read this chapter, I definitely thought we should get her on the podcast to hear her thoughts. And firstly, Shobhankita, welcome.
Thanks, Ashwin. Thanks so much for deciding to talk about this chapter.
Okay, diving straight to the topic. I found the framing of your chapter, which you've titled as Juggernaut or Embers of a Dying Fire. This is the title that you've given your chapter in regards to talking about China. And that's a proactive and an interesting framing. What are you trying to convey to the readers with this title?
Yeah. No, thanks for that. This is actually Pranay, the co-author, right? So this was Pranay's idea to title it this way. And you can trust Pranay to not be boring when he writes. But really, I think the idea was everyone seems to think of China as this overwhelming, overbearing, powerful force. And it is really, over the last 30 years or so, China has transformed itself from being this copycat of otherwise Western products broadly, a cheap manufacturer of these products really. And it has transformed itself into really doing cutting-edge R&D in high-tech sectors, be it in military technology, be it in nuclear fusion, quantum tech, biotechnology. In so many of these sectors, China is leaps and leaps forward from where it started out only 30 years ago, right? So it's a remarkable journey that China has had, not just in its economic growth, but also in its innovation ecosystem. But I think what people don't tend to really recognize is that there are chinks in China's armor. And I think the chapter is focused on understanding what brought China to where it is today over the past 30 years, really the ingredients to China's science and tech success, if you will. And then to sort of prognosticate as to where might this ecosystem be headed and what does that then mean for a country like India, because China is our foremost adversary. I mean, there's no two ways about that, and a formidable force at that. So really to understand what the chinks in that armor might be. And our takeaway from the chapter, but also our takeaway really is that there are chinks in China's armor which are perhaps only today signals, but they're real. And these are things that we must be paying attention to, because that opens up opportunities for India to then collaborate or negotiate with China, because China is not really this juggernaut as it's made out to be. So that's really the title and where it comes from, that this is, the dying fire, really, right? So what we see are the remnants of what is possibly China's peak. And that's a brave and controversial statement to make. But hey, we picked a side and we are willing to change our opinions when we have other data to prove in the opposite direction. But regardless, this is our prognosis today, that there have been formidable things that have happened the last 30 years, but the next 10 years and 15 years might not be the same.
Okay, very interesting. And for someone like me sitting outside this, perched outside of China, observing and hearing about news that China has done this or China has done that, generally the rest of us are very cut off from what is happening inside China. But China is not that cut off, as you indicate in your chapter. How does this work? So they have kept the door open for new ideas, innovation, collaboration, and all the goodies that come with it from the outside. But we are not privy to that, or they have a balance in the way they control information, right? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah. So I think this is one of those misunderstood things about China. And really, Bill Clinton in 2000 had also famously remarked that controlling the internet would be like nailing jello to a wall. And really, this was China trying to institute what is today called the Great Firewall, which is domestic control on the internet, but also, cutting off access from external and Western social media platforms or companies into China. But to then think that China was cut off while it still grew is again not fully true, because Google continued for a long time to have an office in China. And sure, they didn't have Google Chrome, but they did have Android services to mobile manufacturers in China, right? So it was not like China was completely cut off from the rest of the world. And really, I think one important ingredient for China's success has been foreign technology acquisition and its ability to very practically learn from others, and especially learn from others that China has political and ideological differences with. This could be Europe, this could be Japan, this could be the West. And this is throughout history, right? Even back in Deng Xiaoping era, even before that in the 19th century with the self-strengthening movement. We've had examples of Chinese bureaucrats, politicians going out of their way to appease and learn from people who they thought were superiors technologically, militarily, etc. Right? So that's really one of China's strengths, the ability to be very practical and also humble when it learns from others. And this entire idea of foreign technology acquisition, I think, really, really helped China. And even as they instituted these domestic controls on free speech, etc., there was still a very generous opening of talent, capital, as well as ideas. So R&D free flow between China and the others, all the other countries, as well as the free flow of talent. Everything else, right? So really, China really grew because it has been the greatest benefactor of globalization the last 30 years. And then to say that China grew by being cut off from the rest of the world is absolutely not true. So it did advance itself by freely accommodating the needs and by advancing itself by accommodating the help from everybody else.
Okay, and another big pillar that is often cited in the Chinese growth story is how they invested in their human capital and other infrastructure. And that is always something that we say should be done whenever we are talking in terms of a developing country, one like India, right? That we have to invest in our people, we have to invest in education, we have to invest in capabilities. But China's story is something which includes this, and they have done it. So can you tell us a little about how this happened there?
Yeah. So I think a lot of attention on China's growth story gets attributed to the Chinese state. The fact that China has a venture capitalist state, which has a heavy state focus, invests a lot of money into technology areas that it has outlined. And it is this that gets often attributed to its success. But again, this has to be looked upon very carefully, because state capitalism in China has its weaknesses. It's led to a huge wastage of what is essentially public money, and it has come at a huge cost. If you see, large warehouses and large farm acre land sizes of electric vehicles that have been disposed, that have been left abandoned, you do see that the Chinese state focusing on some of these sectors has led to that waste. It has led to people taking risks. It has led to people seeking out these subsidies and starting out ventures that they otherwise would not. It has led to brutal competition. And this has in turn led to a lot of wastage when finally the sector consolidates and many people lose out, right? But it has also been the Chinese way of focusing on a few sectors and advancing itself. But of course, it has come at a cost. And in many sectors, this has not worked. So if you look at the semiconductor sector, or if you look at the jet engine sector, this has really not worked. For all its focus on trying to dispose, say, Airbus or Boeing with its own in-house manufacturer, in the aerospace sector, China has not really come up with any formidable competitor. So clearly, it has its weaknesses. But I think what doesn't get spoken about enough is really China's investments in infrastructure, human capital, and capabilities. So, for a long time, at least 4% of Chinese GDP, touching 4% of Chinese GDP, was being invested into education. And this education was in the primary and secondary sectors, so really school level education, really. And they've also invested, say, up to 6% or so in infrastructure, which is telecom, roads, airports, ports, railways. So it's these infrastructures that have then enabled China to emerge as the factory of the world. It has allowed China to emerge really as this powerhouse when it comes to manufacturing. And it has that eventually led way to innovation, R&D, and so on to come about, right? So I don't think enough attention is given to just the basic things that a state must do, which is focus on human capital, focus on infrastructure, investments, capabilities, human capital, skilling. So if you compare, for example, just the data in similar time periods from India and China, you can see that the difference is vast. The fact that China was growing multifold year on year, and it was increasingly investing that growth into these base capabilities meant that in a period of 20 years, India and China, when it comes to the number of graduates, number of literate people, number of PhDs, any of these metrics, the numbers are really, really vast and favorable towards China. So I think that is the foundational, fundamental base upon which the rest of Chinese science and tech innovation ecosystem is then built upon.
Okay, and in this focus of investing in their human capital and learning from others, the logical step that the Chinese must have taken, and I assume they have taken, is that there was a lot of demand for Chinese students seeking out admissions in foreign universities and then going on and learning technology fields from Western universities, and then that finally helping China in some way or the other. And this is something that India is also reckoned with, right? That India has a huge student base, and we frame the human drain issue as a problem for India, that we are losing our young minds to foreign countries and foreign corporations. But I assume this has played out in China as well. And how did China handle this?
Yeah, I think China is really unique in the scale and focus with which it has tried to harness its human capital, and specifically high-tech talent that's both Chinese and foreign origin, to advance China's interests. So the Young Thousand Talents program often gets cited, but there are so many programs across provincial and local government levels, not just the central national level government, that are focused on harnessing talent. And this is really advanced, coordinated, coherent, and it's global, right? So in terms of investing in capital, training capital, candidate evaluation networks that then source candidates abroad to advance China's interests. Just the scale of that database and then how it operates is huge. But what's important to remember is that all of this is not focused necessarily to get human capital back to China. Sometimes that's not possible, because I think that's something that we run into as well. If we were to attract high talent back into India, the first question is, how does the state pay for it? Because we cannot match US, Europe level salaries for somebody who would be based out of India. And it squarely runs into bureaucratic issues such as the salaries that perhaps an IIT professor gets in India, while somebody of that equal caliber would be expected outside, right? So China worked around that in two ways. One is that they have worked to harness talent by sending them abroad on government-sponsored education schemes. And the second is then also to keep people where they are abroad, but also harness their knowledge capabilities for China's interests. So the goal is not always to get people back to China, but to keep them where they are, source ideas, have them work on a part-time, freelance, all kinds of arrangements, and then have a basic center inside of China that then kind of sources these ideas and then seeks to commercialize them. So there are multiple of these efforts that China has made in trying to advance its human capital, right? For example, the Chengdu high-tech zone has about 31 offshore centers, and it's spread across Japan, Europe, and the US. So the idea then is not necessarily to get people back, but keep them where they are, pay them commensurate and not even full-time salaries, because sometimes they are perhaps engaged elsewhere, but this is sort of the Serve the Motherland initiative, and sort of appeasing to people's patriotic sense to then contribute in the way they can to advance Chinese interests. And throughout also, we have also seen that foreign students, exchange students, were constantly incentivized with high salaries to come into China for a short period of time on a contractual basis, and then contribute to China's labs and R&D centers. So we've seen all kinds of arrangements, and largely it has worked, except in the recent past where we see some of these global talent pools and capital flows being sort of cut off because of US-China tensions. But otherwise, broadly, I think this has worked well for China.
The US-China tensions and the changes in China's approach to some of these problems are sometimes very specific to the Xi Jinping era, right? And Xi's reign has also been it's been a break in pattern, and it's something that you can clearly delineate what was before and what is after. So while a lot of the progress that China started to make has probably started with leaders like Deng Xiaoping, we are currently in the Xi Jinping era, and how does that?
Yeah.
What is new there? How has it helped China? How has it hurt China? What are the policies like?
Yeah. So several scholars have actually classified the Deng Xiaoping and even the Hu Jintao era as China in its developmental state model. But today it's clearly in a techno-nationalistic state model, right? I mean, since 2012, 2013. So I think the Xi Jinping era is a mixed bag, as most eras and leaderships are. So what's happened is that there is heavy focus on technology. There is heavy focus on techno-nationalism. There's also heavy focus on China finally rising up to its promised state, as it were, right? As in finally rising up to what has been China's promise and the Great Rejuvenation and so on, as has been popular in the Chinese imagination. So we see a lot of capital flowing into the Chinese science and tech ecosystem the last decade. We see a lot of corruption with that, but we also see Xi's political style being one of control, being one of clearly demarcating authority and decision making from the ministerial and bureaucratic structures into the party structure directly under his oversight. So we see that change in several ways, right? In 2023, China had an S&T structural reform. Early on, also, internet governance was shifted from one authority to another, and the way it was structured was directly under the party structure and not necessarily the ministerial bureaucratic structure. So we see an increase in direct oversight and centralized control. And with that, we also see more money flowing into the system, and we also see a great number of purges. We have so many cases of officials who have been investigated for corruption and then removed from office. And we see a lot of this over the last 10 years. And this seems to be across the board. This is not necessarily in the science and tech wing, but it's also across. It's in the PLA, it's in other forms in the party. So clearly, this is somebody who is tightening up control and also clearly must be a little insecure to be doing some of this, right? So we see this great focus with, for example, the Made in China 2025 scheme, and so many other schemes like this over the last 10 years, specifically the focus on AI that started in 2017, the focus on military tech, the focus on so many of these sectors, and doubling down with great investment in capital, but also this sort of weakness in terms of control and with that purchase.
This control and purging has not just been inside the government, but also sometimes towards the private sector. So I have often noticed this contradiction in the Chinese government often supporting its private industry so well, and at other times often like coming for them and treating them like they are an adversary or a challenge to the PLA itself, to the Chinese government itself. So where is this contradiction coming from? What is the thinking behind this kind of behavior?
So I think that two things are true. One is that the private sector really has been the engine for technology advancement in China. Technology advancements in China, as much as the state has focused on them via the public sector enterprises that China calls the state-owned enterprises, which are essentially the PSUs equivalent in India, they have not really done much either for growth or employment or for innovation, right? So these SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, actually serve other purposes for the Chinese state, which is, for example, in absorbing unemployment, in ensuring control over important structures in the Chinese economy, things like that. But it's not really technology growth or even economy growth, right? That has come from private sector. So all the titans that we hear of today, be it BYD, be it CATL, be it Unitree, Alibaba, all of them are private sector companies. And really, they have been the engine for growth. But at the same time, the CCP has always been skeptical and wary of structures that directly confront and stand up to its own strength. And I think that's where the key tussle for the Chinese state in terms of the private sector is, which is it's good for the economy and overall growth, and also the technology, but it could potentially get so large as to undermine its own interests. I think that is the push and pull. And we have typically seen this sort of easing and tightening when it comes to regulations on the private sector, right? And the private sector in China, you know, it's not in a very enviable situation, because they have this really difficult minefield to walk through, which is balancing the CCP's interests while advancing their own business and consumer needs. So it's not very easy. So I think that's really the tussle. So we see, for example, over 2022 and 2023, we had this long period of clampdowns on the private sector, which led to many of them going bankrupt. Billions of dollars from the stock market being wiped off, FDI suffering into the Chinese stock markets. All of that is true. And then we again have early this year, Xi Jinping sort of reaching out to the same private sector tycoons, calling out Jack Ma, who attends this ceremony, which is very high profile, highly advertised. So we see this back and forth constantly, because at the root of it, that tussle and insecurity for its own self while advancing the needs for China's economy, both are true and real at the same time.
That's very fascinating. And from the overall picture of what China is and how it has become what it is today, if you want to, based on the ideas that you have discussed, want to prescribe certain things for the Indian ecosystem right now, 3 things that you think are worth getting influenced by, what are they?
Yeah. I think I would like to preface that answer with understanding where the Chinese ecosystem is today and where we think it might be in the next decade or so, right? Going back to the title, we want to believe that China is not all that much of a juggernaut, that there are actually weaknesses. And we point out to a few reasons and signals to this weakness, really. First is US-China escalating tensions, right? Just what has happened over the last 10 years with China's growth, China's aggressive posture to the rest of the world, be it also this skepticism for Chinese products and Chinese companies. For example, what's happened with Huawei, what has happened with so many of these Chinese firms because of US distrust, US consumer, but as well as state, because they are believed to be snooping for the Chinese state. So with some of these tensions with China's growth, there has been this increasing backlash for China. Right now, it's unclear how much of that is coordinated and coherent across countries in Europe, Australia, Japan, and the US. But we know that attempts to decouple from China are real, right? So that's one. That's definitely going to hurt Chinese interests, because remember, domestically in China, many of these companies face brutal competition. And China is not really a consumer society, which is that they save more than they spend. So it's in Chinese business interest to actually export and to be based outside. And if this is the kind of backlash they face on all sides, or at least most sides, as they try to export, that's not very good for Chinese business interests. So there is definitely the cost of geopolitical backlash. And secondly, even domestically, with the tightening and easing with the Chinese private sector that the state has followed, again, domestically, private sector in China is not in the best of place. It's not a very enviable situation. So that's another. The third, I think, is local government fiscal stress. There is a lot of fiscal stress in local governments in China, and Amit, our colleague, has studied this in depth. But I think what's clear is that there's a lot of off-the-book financing. There's a lot of unaccounted for income. There's a lot of income that they're not getting because the private sector because the property sector, because the property sector has had a crash and that has suffered. And with that, the income for local governments, which is broadly based on the real estate income and property sector, has also crashed. So there's a lot of fiscal stress at the local government level, which hinders their ability to further subsidize and incentivize science and tech innovations. And finally, we see what Jeffrey Ding calls the diffusion deficit. And what he argues for is that it's not the ability to come up with new innovations, but the ability to be able to integrate innovations from others or from yourself, but really doesn't matter, into multiple industries across the board. And that really helps advance your economy. And so from that, what we see is there are several indicators to point that China is actually a strong innovation capacity country, but not so much diffusion capacity, right? So when it comes to a few things like high-speed rail and consumer internet and digital payments, China obviously has a high adoption rate. But in B2B, we see that China and Chinese firms in general have not adopted to technology very fast. So even if China comes up with new technologies, the rate at which this can be advanced throughout its economy in a way that's a lot more horizontal and broad-based, that is, that seems to have a weakness. So if this is the environment that China finds itself in domestically, with global talent, capital, FDI, all of that, slowly sort of tapering off and suffering, we see US-China tensions really at its peak. And of course, we see a sign of that reversing recently because, NVIDIA is now allowed to export to China, but now China doesn't want to import from NVIDIA because that comes with the geo-tracking on the chips and that distrust along with that. So while this entire thing plays out, what suffers is Chinese economy. And remember, Chinese economy is, of course, also slowing, not doing great. It's an economy that's growing old very fast. It's also high unemployment. So it has multiple indicators for weaknesses. And all of this seem to be a double whammy at the same time for the Chinese citizen and the state also, right? Because the ability of the Chinese state to survive is dependent on its ability to deliver the most basic growth expectations of its citizens. And because of the spectacular 30-year, 35-year growth that China has had, expectations are high. And people are going to compare themselves to their parents and their grandparents in China and then say, oh, maybe my life is not as good. And maybe, so that's this precarious situation that the Chinese state and party sort of finds itself in. So if that's the situation that the Chinese state and party finds itself in, there may be opportunities for India to collaborate with China in a way that advances India's interests. Because one thing that sort of struck out to me through all of this research is that Chinese ability to be practical, humble, and advance itself in a way that's super selfish is something that India perhaps has not done to an extent that India's multilateral partnerships, etc., could perhaps sort of theoretically prove for India, right? So we have not had that culture so far, and maybe it's time for us to start that and firstly collaborate with China on a few sectors. And of course, we are not arguing for very critical strategic defense applications to be sourced from China, because this is still a balance between China being our biggest adversary, but also the fact that China is so embedded in global manufacturing supply chains today that India couldn't necessarily develop and grow its own manufacturing base without the help of China. So it is that balance that we argue for, because we have a lot that we can offer China in return. We offer a good counterweight to both the US and China in some sense. So we must, in our own strategic autonomy and interest, see what best sort of applies to us and our interests. And no, we shouldn't be allowing TikTok into India. But for example, in solar panels, electronics manufacturing, in so many of these, we must at least seek to negotiate, either BYD coming over and setting up sort of a base in India to advance our own employment, our own export prospects, things like that, right? Now, I understand that this might not be in Chinese interest to do that, but this might be the best window of opportunity for us to negotiate that as China tries to negotiate US-China tariffs and the Trump administrations, right? So I think that's the broad prognosis that we leave, which is first, we might want to rethink what is even critical and strategic, because if you look at our PLI scheme, electronic and mobile manufacturing cannot be strategic for India, right? I mean, it's far from that. And that is perhaps a sector that we can be partnering with China, because China is still a force there. But in so many other sectors, maybe we have to look at different approaches and different frameworks in a way that's sectoral, in a way that's important in terms of, do we have local capabilities for that or no? And if we don't, maybe we get it. But if we do, if we want to protect our local manufacturers from Chinese competition and Chinese subsidies. So it is that balance that we must play through. And I think that's the broad recommendation for India as to be open to Chinese investments, talent, and capital.
Okay, that has been most fascinating, Shobhankita. Thank you. This has been a great conversation, and hope that all the ideas we discussed has sparked interest in our listeners to check out the book chapter. The title of the book is China, Indian Perspectives on China's Politics, Economy and Foreign Relations. Besides Shobhankita and Pranay, who have co-authored this chapter, Juggernaut or the Embers of a Dying Flame, there have been other of my colleagues at the Takshashila Institution who have also written chapters of their own. And if you're interested, please pick this book up. And thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.